The red phone wouldn't stop ringing. Stanislav Petrov stared at it, his hand frozen 6 inches from the receiver. On the screen in front of him, 5 words blinked in blood-red letters. Missile attack. High confidence. His heart slammed against his ribs. Around him, 40 officers had gone silent, their faces pale in the glow of the emergency lights. They were all looking at him, waiting. The phone was a direct line to Soviet High Command. Pick it up, report the attack, and within 8 minutes, 3,000 nuclear warheads would launch toward the United States. Within 30 minutes, American missiles would respond. Within 2 hours, civilization would end. Don't pick it up, and America's first strike would annihilate the Soviet Union without retaliation. The computer showed 5 American missiles inbound. The satellites didn't lie. The system had never failed. His orders were absolute. Report all attacks immediately. But Petrov's hand wouldn't move. Somewhere deep in his gut, beneath the terror and training and 3 years of Cold War conditioning, a voice whispered that something was wrong. 5 missiles made no sense. It was either the end of the world or the mistake of the century. He had 30 seconds to decide which, and he was about to get it catastrophically wrong, or impossibly right. Stanislav Petrov hadn't wanted to be at Serpukhov 15 that night. He was covering for a colleague who'd called in sick, taking a shift that wasn't his in a job that had slowly ground him down over 3 years. The bunker sat 43 feet underground, a concrete tomb filled with computers and monitors and the constant hum of cooling fans working overtime. No windows, no fresh air, just the blue glow of screens and the knowledge that somewhere above them, the world continued while they waited for it to end. He joined the Soviet Air Defense Forces because his father had been military, because the alternative was worse, because in the Soviet Union, you didn't always get to choose your path. They'd trained him on the new satellite early warning system, OKO they called it, a network of satellites that watched American missile bases 24 hours a day, waiting for the heat signatures that would indicate a launch. The system was supposed to be foolproof. Designed by the best Soviet engineers, tested extensively, calibrated to detect the exact thermal signature of an American ICBM breaking through the atmosphere. The satellites couldn't be fooled by weather or reflections or anything except an actual missile launch. That's what they'd been told. That's what the system's designers swore. Petrov had his doubts, but doubts didn't matter in the Soviet military. You followed orders. You trusted the system. You did your job. His job was simple in theory. Monitor the satellite feeds, and if an attack was detected, immediately report it to Soviet High Command. They would have minutes to decide whether to launch a counterstrike before American missiles reached Soviet soil. The entire system was built on speed, on removing human hesitation from the decision to end the world. He'd been at his post for 7 hours when the alarm went off. The sound cut through the quiet bunker like a knife. Red lights flooded the command center. Every officer in the room snapped to attention. Petrov's eyes went to the main display. Missile attack. Warning. Launch detected. 1 missile originating from the United States. High confidence. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The moment they'd trained for. The moment everyone said would never actually come, because both sides understood the consequences. Except it was happening. Right now. He reached for the phone to Moscow. Then the system updated. 2nd missile detected. His hand froze. 2 missiles. That didn't make sense. If the Americans were launching a first strike, if they were trying to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to retaliate, They would launch everything at once. Hundreds of missiles, thousands, not two. Third missile detected. The officers behind him were shouting. Protocol demanded immediate reporting. Every second of delay gave the Americans an advantage. But Petrov's mind was racing through the scenarios. 3 missiles. Why 3? It wasn't enough to destroy Soviet command and control. Wasn't enough to take out the missile silos. It was barely enough to hit Moscow. 4th missile. Detected. His training screamed at him to make the call. His gut screamed something else. 5th missile. Detected. 5 missiles. That was it. The system showed no more launches, just 5. And suddenly, Petrov understood why this felt wrong. The Americans weren't stupid. If they were going to launch a nuclear first strike, if they were going to risk the end of civilization, they wouldn't send 5 missiles. They would send everything. The Pentagon had wargamed this scenario 1,000 times. Everyone knew the doctrine. Overwhelming force, decapitation strike, launch enough missiles to guarantee the Soviet Union couldn't respond. 5 missiles was a computer error, not a war plan. But he couldn't be sure. The system had never failed before. The satellites were 600 miles above the Earth, watching with infrared sensors that couldn't lie about heat signatures. 5 separate detections meant 5 separate thermal blooms. 5 launches, unless the system was seeing something else. Sunlight reflecting off clouds, sensor glitches, something. The phone sat in front of him. His officers were waiting. Moscow was waiting. The entire Soviet response system was waiting for him to do his job. Petrov picked up the phone, but he didn't call the missile attack in as real. He reported it as a system malfunction. The words came out steady, calmer than he felt. False alarm, computer error, stand down. The room erupted. His deputy commander grabbed his shoulder. The system shows 5 missiles, 5 confirmations. You can't. It's a malfunction, Petrov said again. He didn't know if he was right. Couldn't know. But 5 missiles made no strategic sense, and that single fact was all he had to hold on to in a moment when certainty didn't exist. The minutes crawled past. If he was wrong, American missiles would hit Soviet soil in less than 20 minutes. Moscow would burn. Military bases would be vaporized. And the Soviet Union would have no time to respond, because Stanislav Petrov had decided his gut feeling mattered more than the most sophisticated early warning system ever built. He sat at his console, watching the clock, waiting to find out if he'd just saved the world or doomed his country. The alarms kept screaming, the screens kept blinking, and Petrov kept breathing, in and out, counting the seconds until he'd know. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. No missiles hit Soviet soil. No mushroom clouds bloomed over Moscow. No secondary alarms indicated an actual attack was underway. Slowly, carefully, the officers at Serpukhov 15 began to accept what Petrov had insisted from the beginning. It had been a false alarm. The technical investigation took weeks. Engineers examined every component of the satellite system, traced every signal, analyzed every piece of data from that night. What they found was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The satellites had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over the United States. At a specific angle, at a specific time, the reflection created a heat signature that matched the thermal bloom of a missile launch. The computer, designed to err on the side of reporting threats, had interpreted the data exactly as programmed. 5 separate satellites, 5 separate false positives. The system had worked perfectly according to its design. It had also nearly started World War III. Petrov expected commendation, perhaps a promotion. At minimum, recognition that his judgment had prevented catastrophe. Instead, he received silence. The Soviet military didn't want to acknowledge that their billion-ruble early warning system could be fooled by sunlight. Didn't want to admit that the automation they'd spent years perfecting had failed in the exact scenario it was designed for. Didn't want the story spreading that one officer's disobedience had been the only thing standing between civilization and annihilation. So they buried it. Petrov was interviewed extensively, debriefed. His decision was analyzed and reanalyzed. Some officers praised his judgment. Others argued he'd violated protocol and endangered the Soviet Union by failing to report what the system detected. The debate went up through military channels, getting quieter as it climbed, until finally it disappeared into classified files that wouldn't be opened for decades. There was no medal, no public recognition. Instead, Petrov received a reprimand for incomplete paperwork during the incident. The official record showed he'd failed to properly document the event in the duty log. That was all. He continued working at Serpukhov 15 for a few more months, but the weight of what had happened and what hadn't happened settled over him like radiation you couldn't wash off. He'd made the right call. He knew that. Everyone knew that. But he'd also exposed how fragile the entire system was, how close the world sat to the edge, how one man's judgment was all that stood between doctrine and disaster. He took early retirement in 1984, left the military, tried to build a quiet life away from bunkers and alarms, and the knowledge that he'd held the fate of hundreds of millions in his hands for 30 seconds. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged what happened that night. When the story finally leaked years later, after the Cold War ended and classified documents began surfacing, Petrov was living in a small apartment outside Moscow on a pension that barely covered expenses. He gave a few interviews, told the story in his quiet, matter-of-fact way, insisted he wasn't a hero, just a man who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time and made a guess that happened to be correct. But historians understood what journalists and the public slowly realized. Stanislav Petrov had prevented the most catastrophic event in human history, not through bravery or brilliance, but through simple skepticism. Through asking the one question the system was designed to eliminate: does this make sense? He died in 2017 at 77, largely unknown outside academic and policy circles. There was no state funeral, no memorial at Serpukhov 15, which had been decommissioned years earlier. Just a quiet burial and obituaries that struggled to capture the magnitude of what he'd done by doing nothing. The irony haunted people who studied the incident. Petrov had been punished for preventing nuclear war. The system that nearly caused it was upgraded and continued operating. The doctrine of rapid response and automated decision-making remained unchanged. Because acknowledging that Petrov was right meant acknowledging that the entire architecture of nuclear deterrence rested on a foundation more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. How many other Petrovs were out there, sitting in bunkers and command centers, staring at screens and waiting for alarms that might mean the end of everything? How many times had the world come that close without anyone knowing? How many near misses were buried in classified files because the truth was too terrifying to acknowledge? The answers remained classified, but the question lingered. In the years after his death, Petrov's story spread. Schools taught it, films referenced it, He received posthumous recognition from various organizations, awards for preventing nuclear war that arrived decades too late to mean anything to the man who'd actually made the choice. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from a group of former Cold War officers, American and Soviet, who met at a conference on nuclear policy years after the incident became public. They'd all served in similar roles, monitoring early warning systems, trained to report attacks immediately, conditioned to trust their instruments over their instincts. One American officer said what they were all thinking. "I would have made the call. I would have reported it as real." The room went quiet, because that was the truth nobody wanted to face. Almost anyone else in Petrov's position would have followed protocol, would have reported what the system detected, would have started the chain of events that led to nuclear exchange. Stanislav Petrov hesitated when hesitation wasn't allowed. He doubted when doubt was forbidden. He chose to trust human judgment in a system built to eliminate it. And for 30 seconds of uncertainty, in a bunker south of Moscow, on a September night in 1983, the world survived. The question that haunts everyone who learns his story isn't whether he made the right choice. He did. The question is whether we'll be that lucky next time.